You know, life is fundamentally about suffering. There's no escaping it. Everyone carries some burden, loss, betrayal, illness, disappointment. And the temptation is always to ask, why me? Why this? Why now? But that question, while natural, can trap you in bitterness. The deeper question, the one that actually transforms you, is what is the meaning behind this? What is the purpose in this suffering? Life is suffering. That is one of the most brutal and yet undeniable truths we face as human beings. To deny it is to blind ourselves to reality. From the moment you were born, you are already set on a path where pain, loss, and hardship are waiting. People you love will pass away, your body will weaken with age, dreams you had will collapse, and betrayal may come from those you trusted most. It's not a matter of if you will suffer, it's only a matter of when. And so to live as if suffering were some sort of anomaly is to set yourself up for disillusionment. Because life is suffering, and suffering is the very condition of existence. Now, this is not to say life is only suffering. There is joy, love, laughter, beauty, and transcendence. But those things shine as bright as they do precisely because they are contrasted against suffering. Imagine a life without pain. Would joy even mean anything? If there were no loss, could love carry the same weight? Suffering is the background against which every meaningful experience is painted. Without the shadow, there would be no depth. Without the cost, there would be no value. This truth can sound cruel, but it's actually the beginning of wisdom. Because when you recognize suffering as fundamental, you stop asking, how can I avoid it? And you start asking, how do I endure it? How do I rise above it? That's where strength begins to take shape. If you walk into life expecting it to always be comfortable, you will collapse at the first sign of hardship. But if you face life with the knowledge that suffering is unavoidable, you arm yourself with the resilience required to endure. Consider the story of Job in the Bible. Job was a man who had everything: wealth, family, health, honor, and it was all stripped away. He suffered more than most of us can imagine. Yet, even in his agony, even in his questions, Job came to realize that suffering is not without purpose. His trials revealed the depth of his faith, the endurance of his soul, and ultimately the sovereignty of God. Job's story forces us to confront the truth. Suffering is not evidence of God's absence, but rather the very place where his presence can be most powerfully experienced. Think also about your own life. Reflect on the moments that shaped who you are. Chances are those defining moments weren't the easiest ones. They were the nights you thought you couldn't go on, the days when life broke you down to nothing, the seasons where you lost more than you thought you could bear. And yet those are the very experiences that carved out your strength, deepened your empathy, and made you capable of handling more than you once believed possible. Pain has a way of chiseling the soul, stripping away arrogance, illusions, and false securities, leaving behind someone more grounded, more aware, more human. When you accept that life is suffering, you also accept the responsibility to face it, and responsibility is what gives life meaning. Viktor Frankl, a man who endured the horrors of the concentration camps, observed that people could survive almost any suffering if they could find meaning in it. But the ones who could not find meaning, who saw their pain as only senseless cruelty, those were the ones who collapsed in despair. Meaning transforms suffering from punishment into preparation, from chaos into order, from despair into hope. And so suffering must not be seen as an interruption to life, but as a central feature of it. Every person who has ever lived has carried a cross of some kind. Every person you meet is battling something you cannot see. To recognize this is not to be defeated. It is to awaken. It is to understand that the burden you carry is not a mistake, but a call to courage, bitterness, or transformation. That is the crossroads suffering places before every human being. When pain enters your life, it carries with it a choice. You can allow it to make you resentful, cynical, and hardened, or you can allow it to mold you into someone wiser, stronger, and more compassionate. Pain doesn't leave you neutral. It either corrodes your heart with bitterness or it refines your character into something greater than it was before. And the outcome depends almost entirely on how you respond to it. Bitterness often feels like the natural reaction to suffering. Something goes wrong, something unfair, undeserved, or overwhelming, and immediately the thought arises, why me? Why should I have to endure this? Why do others seem to have it easier? That kind of thinking feeds resentment. It creates a mindset where the entire world feels hostile, where every difficulty is interpreted as an attack, and where the heart becomes closed off to hope. People who go down that path often become trapped in anger. They relive their wounds over and over, rehearsing them until those wounds define their entire identity. The pain becomes their lens, and through it, they can no longer see anything good, anything redeemable, anything worth striving for. But there is another way. Transformation is also possible, and it begins the moment you choose not to be consumed by resentment. Transformation comes when you ask, what can this suffering teach me? How can this pain change me for the better? What strength is being drawn out of me that would not exist otherwise? Instead of letting bitterness shrink your soul, transformation expands it. Instead of poisoning your perspective, it purifies your motives. Through transformation, suffering ceases to be only destructive and begins to serve as the raw material for growth. History and scripture alike are full of examples of this choice. Think of Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned for years. He could have become bitter, letting hatred for his family and rage against injustice consume him. Yet he chose transformation. He grew in wisdom, patience, and leadership. In time, he was elevated to a position where he not only saved his people from famine, but was able to forgive the very brothers who had wronged him. His story illustrates the profound truth that the very suffering intended for evil can be the instrument of good if the heart resists bitterness. This dynamic is just as real in the everyday struggles of ordinary people. Some lose everything, a career, relationship, their health, and yet emerge from the experience softer toward others, more thankful for what remains and more aware of life's fragility. Others, faced with the same kinds of losses, turn inward, lash out, and carry anger for decades. The difference is not in the suffering itself, but in how the soul interprets and responds to it. Transformation through suffering often produces qualities that cannot be learned in times of ease. Compassion, for instance, is rarely born from comfort. People who have walked through their own valleys are the ones best equipped to understand and comfort those who are hurting. Patience, humility, resilience, faith, these are forged in the fires of difficulty. The pain itself is not good, but what it produces in those who choose transformation can be invaluable. The decision between bitterness and transformation is made in countless small moments. It is made when you choose to forgive instead of holding a grudge. It is made when you choose gratitude for what you still have rather than obsession with what you lost. It is made when you decide to keep trusting God's goodness even when you cannot see the reason behind your suffering. Each choice either deepens the roots of bitterness or strengthens the foundations of transformation. Bitterness isolates. Transformation connects. Bitterness blinds you to possibility. Transformation opens your eyes to new horizons. Bitterness destroys your capacity to love. Transformation increases it. One path leads to decay of the spirit, the other to renewal. And though suffering forces you to the crossroads, it never forces the direction you take. That choice remains yours. Responsibility in suffering is one of the most difficult but essential truths to grasp. Pain arrives uninvited, and often it is not your fault. You may lose your health without warning, be abandoned by someone you trusted, or face financial ruin through circumstances beyond your control. It's natural to want to blame someone, to find an explanation that allows you to escape the weight of it. But at some point, you are confronted with a reality. Regardless of how suffering came into your life, the responsibility for how you respond to it rests on your shoulders. No one else can carry that choice for you. Suffering strips away illusions of control. You realize very quickly that you cannot dictate every outcome or prevent every loss. Yet within that helplessness lies a paradox. You still hold power. You cannot always control what happens to you, but you can control what happens within you. That is the essence of responsibility. It is the recognition that your inner world, your choices, your responses remain yours to govern even when everything else feels stolen. Responsibility in suffering means refusing to surrender your agency to despair. Think of the people who allow suffering to turn them into perpetual victims. Their story becomes one long narrative of what was done to them, of how unfairly they were treated, of how impossible life has been. And while all of that may be true, the tragedy is that they never move beyond it. By refusing responsibility, they lock themselves into the identity of someone powerless, someone defined only by their wounds. But those who embrace responsibility in suffering tell a different story. They may acknowledge the depth of their pain, but they do not allow it to define the totality of their lives. They choose to carry their burden with dignity, and in doing so, they demonstrate that the human spirit is stronger than the circumstances that press against it. This principle is not abstract. It is seen vividly in the lives of those who have endured extreme hardship. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust, wrote that even in the most dehumanizing conditions, one freedom remained untouched: the freedom to choose one's attitude in the face of suffering. While guards could strip away his possessions, starve his body, and humiliate his dignity, they could not dictate how he responded internally. Frankl's decision to take responsibility for his inner life, even in the camps, is what allowed him not only to endure, but also to emerge with wisdom that has helped millions. His story illustrates that responsibility in suffering is not about denying pain, but about reclaiming the part of yourself that remains free no matter how heavy the chains. Responsibility also brings meaning. When you take ownership of your response, you transform suffering from something that merely crushes into something that shapes. You begin to ask different questions. Instead of, "Why is this happening to me?" you ask, "How can I carry this in a way that honors God, that strengthens me, that blesses others?" Responsibility redirects the energy of suffering away from self-pity and toward purpose. It does not erase the difficulty, but it reframes it as an opportunity to reveal strength and resilience you might not have known were there. Faith deepens this sense of responsibility. In prayer, you recognize that God has entrusted you with this moment, however painful it may be. The responsibility is not only to endure it, but to seek what it might cultivate in you. Perhaps it is patience, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps courage. The suffering itself is not chosen, but the refinement it can bring becomes a responsibility you do choose. And when you see suffering through this lens, responsibility shifts from being a burden into being a calling. To take responsibility in suffering is to declare that you will not let what has happened to you dictate the final word about who you are. It is to accept the weight of your cross and carry it as faithfully as you can. It is to refuse the easy path of bitterness and instead step into the harder but nobler path of growth. In that choice lies the difference between being crushed by suffering and being transformed by it. Faith gives meaning. Without faith, suffering often feels like nothing more than chaos, random, senseless, and cruel. It becomes a storm with no center, a darkness with no end. When a person looks at their pain only through the lens of chance or fate, it is easy to be overwhelmed by despair. But faith transforms the experience entirely. Faith says there is a purpose even when you cannot see it. Faith says there is a design even in what looks like destruction. Faith says that God is present even when silence feels like his only response. Prayer becomes the channel through which this faith takes form. In prayer, you open your heart to God, not merely asking him to remove the suffering, but asking him to reveal what he is doing within it. This is a radical shift. Instead of begging for escape, you begin to search for meaning. Instead of resenting the pain, you begin to look for how it might be shaping you, teaching you, preparing you for something greater. Prayer doesn't always change the situation, but it changes the one who prays. It lifts your perspective from the immediate hurt to the eternal horizon. The life of Jesus Christ provides the clearest example of how faith gives meaning to suffering. On the cross, the most brutal form of human agony was transformed into the greatest act of redemption. What appeared to be defeat was in fact victory. What looked like the triumph of evil was actually the unfolding of God's ultimate good. Without faith, the cross is only tragedy. With faith, it is the foundation of hope for all humanity. This shows that suffering, when placed in God's hands, is never wasted. It may break you down, but in faith, it also builds something eternal. People who suffer without faith often collapse into despair because they cannot reconcile their pain with a bigger picture. They see no reason, no value, no possibility that something good could come of it. But people who suffer with faith carry a different posture. They may still cry, grieve, and question, but beneath it all lies an anchor. They believe their pain is not meaningless, that even the hardest moments can be used for growth, transformation, and service to others. Faith does not always give immediate answers, but it gives assurance that answers exist. Scripture reinforces this truth again and again. Paul writes in Romans that a suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. Notice the order. Without faith, suffering ends in despair. With faith, suffering is the beginning of a process that results in hope. This is the mystery and the gift of faith. It turns what should destroy you into the very thing that strengthens you. Pain becomes seed for perseverance. Perseverance becomes the soil where character grows, and character tested and refined becomes the ground out of which unshakable hope emerges. Faith also prevents suffering from isolating you. When you suffer without meaning, you tend to withdraw into yourself, to wallow in loneliness, to believe no one understands. But faith connects you to a larger story. It reminds you that you are part of something beyond yourself, that God is weaving your life into a tapestry bigger than you can see. This connection not only keeps you from despair, but also gives you courage to keep moving forward. Faith tells you that your pain matters, not because it is pleasant, but because it is purposeful. Faith gives meaning by holding suffering within the framework of eternity. What feels unbearable now may one day be revealed as preparation, as foundation, as part of a story that ends in redemption. Prayer sustains this faith, helping you see beyond the immediate agony to the possibility that your suffering is being used for a divine purpose. Even when you cannot understand, you can still believe.